She was an outcast, scorned by a town that saw only sin in her grief, left to face the wilderness alone, a life stirring within her, silent and vulnerable. They watched her wither, a pregnant widow abandoned, until the shadow of a solitary rider offered a cruel twist of fate, or a desperate, unlikely salvation. Before we sink deeper into this forgotten corner of the frontier, tell us, where in this vast world are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and if this tale stirs something within you, consider subscribing for more stories like it. Ilara traced the rough wood grain of the wagon's side, her fingers lingering on the splinters that seemed to mock her own fractured existence. The sun, a relentless eye in the vast, indifferent sky, beat down upon the parched earth, baking the air thick with dust and the scent of dying sage. She had been left here, on the edge of what passed for civilization, but was in truth merely a cluster of hostile gazes and closed doors. The wagon, once a symbol of her fleeting hope, now served as a desolate tomb for her future, and a stark monument to the town's unwavering judgment. The last of the water in her canteen was a mere memory, a damp spot on the canvas, while the faint stirrings within her belly were a constant, aching reminder of the life she was tasked with protecting, a life that seemed destined for the same bleak, forgotten fate as her own. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 2 months, swallowed by the unforgiving currents of a river, swollen with rain and whispers. His death, sudden and brutal, had left her adrift, but it was the silence that followed, the eerie, damning silence of the town, that had truly unmoored her. They hadn't offered condolences, only accusations, their eyes sharp with unspoken condemnations. The weight of their gaze had been heavier than any stone, a constant, suffocating pressure that had driven her to this desolate edge, past the last fence post that marked the boundary of their contempt. She remembered the preacher's wife, her face a mask of false piety, offering a prayer for her soul while her hands clutched a Bible like a shield against contamination. The words had been honeyed with false concern, but the sting of her dismissal had been sharper than any wasp. Ilara had always been an outsider, an enigma in their rigid world, a woman whose beauty and independence were somehow seen as provocations. Now, compounded by the dark rumors that had clung to Thomas like burrs, her very presence had become an unbearable burden to them. The wagon wheels, creaking under the weight of her despair, had carried her further and further from their condemning stares, until the last familiar signpost vanished behind a cloud of red dust, leaving her utterly alone. The emptiness of the horizon ahead matched the cavernous void within her own heart. This abandonment was not just physical, it was a deeper, spiritual severing, a testament to how swiftly human compassion could curdle into cold, unfeeling cruelty. The nights were the hardest, the silence stretching into an endless, echoing chasm where fear and loneliness intertwined. Ilara huddled in the wagon, the flimsy canvas offering little comfort against the biting chill that descended with the sun's departure. Her hands instinctively sought her belly, a silent dialogue with the life growing within, a fragile ember against the encroaching darkness. Thomas had often spoken of the stars, of how they were the eyes of ancestors, watching over those left behind. Tonight, they seemed indifferent, distant pinpricks in a vast, black canvas, offering no solace, no guidance. She had always prided herself on her resilience, a strength forged in a childhood marked by scarcity and hard truths, but this solitude, this crushing weight of abandonment, threatened to break her. A sudden cramp tightened her stomach, a sharp, unwelcome reminder of her precarious state. She pressed her palms against the aching muscle, willing it to subside, willing herself to remain strong. Thomas's death had been so sudden, a final, guttural cry swallowed by the river's roar. One moment, he was there, laughing as he reeled in a catfish. The next, the current had snatched him, pulling him under with an unseen hand. The memory was a recurring nightmare, replaying in vivid, agonizing detail, the futile reach of her hand, the desperate cries lost to the wind. He had been a man of shadows and contradictions, his charm as potent as his unpredictability. Their union had been a whirlwind of passionate intensity, drawing her in like a moth to a dangerous flame. He had offered her escape from a life she detested, but he had also tethered her to secrets she barely understood, secrets that had ultimately led to her ostracization. The townspeople, with their rigid moral compass, had seen through his veneer of rough-hewn charm straight to the core of his questionable dealings. But Ilara, in her own desperate yearning for something more, had chosen to see the man she loved, the man who had promised her a different life. Their marriage, brief and turbulent, had been a defiant act against the societal norms that sought to confine her. Now, that defiance had exacted its price, leaving her with nothing but the echoes of his promises and the heavy burden of their shared history. The river, that monstrous entity that had stolen him, had left her with a stark, undeniable truth. She was utterly alone, adrift in a hostile world, facing a future shrouded in uncertainty. Each passing moment stretched a slow erosion of her spirit. Days bled into a week, each sunrise bringing renewed despair. Ilara rationed her dwindling supplies with the meticulous care of a desperate alchemist. Each morsel of dried meat, each sip of tepid water, a precious commodity. The sun continued its relentless assault, baking the landscape into a shimmering mirage. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that her time was running short. The strength in her limbs was fading, replaced by a weary ache that settled deep in her bones. Just as the last vestiges of hope threatened to dissolve into the shimmering heat, a faint dust cloud appeared on the distant horizon, growing steadily larger. It was a rider, a solitary figure against the vast emptiness. Ilara's heart seized, a chaotic drumbeat in her chest. Was it a miracle, or merely another cruel twist of fate? The figure drew closer, resolving into the silhouette of a man on horseback, his frame tall and lean, his hat pulled low against the sun. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew the land, his horse a dark, powerful beast. As he approached, a cautious glint of steel caught the light from his hip, a silent declaration of his potential for danger. He reined in his horse a respectable distance from her wagon, the animal snorting softly, pawing at the dust. His eyes, partially obscured by the brim of his hat, scanned her and the meager camp, lingering for a moment on the faint swell beneath her worn dress. There was no immediate threat in his posture, no overt aggression, yet his presence was a stark, undeniable intrusion into her fragile world. The air crackled with a silent tension, a wary standoff between two solitary figures on the edge of nowhere. Ilara clutched a rusted iron skillet, her only weapon, behind her back. She had faced enough cruelty to know that kindness was often a disguise, a lure before the trap was sprung. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, surprisingly gentle, cutting through the heavy silence like a sharp knife. "Ma'am," he said, his gaze steady, unwavering, "you look like you're in a heap of trouble." The words, simple and direct, held a strange weight. They weren't a question, but an observation, a recognition of her dire straits. Ilara said nothing, her throat tight, her eyes narrowed, searching for the hidden meaning, the ulterior motive in his unsolicited appearance. She had learned to trust no one, least of all a stranger who emerged from the very wilderness that had swallowed her hope whole. The sun glinted off the silver buckle of his belt, an insignificant detail that held her gaze for a moment, a distraction from the unnerving intensity of his presence. He sat astride his horse, a stoic sentinel against the vast, unforgiving expanse, waiting for her response. Silas, the cowboy, dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of years spent in the saddle, his movements economical, devoid of unnecessary flourish. He led his horse to a small, thorny mesquite tree, giving it a moment of shade, then turned back to Ilara, his gaze still holding that quiet, assessing quality. He carried a leather canteen, its surface beaded with moisture, a tantalizing beacon in the oppressive heat. He offered it to her, silently, without a word. Ilara's eyes darted from his face to the canteen, then back again. Her parched throat ached, a tormenting reminder of her desperate need, but a lifetime of suspicion, honed by the bitter lessons of abandonment, held her immobile. "Who are you?" she finally rasped, her voice thin, fragile, like dry leaves skittering across barren ground. He paused, his hand still extended, the canteen a silent offering. "Silas," he said, his voice deeper now, grounded. "Silas Blackwood, just passing through. Saw your wagon, figured you might need help." The simplicity of his explanation was almost disarming, yet it stirred a fresh wave of suspicion within Ilara. Help was a concept alien to her in these last weeks. Help usually came with a price, a hidden agenda, a sharper betrayal. She remembered the rumors about Thomas, whispers of stolen cattle, of dealings with unsavory characters from the borderlands. He had been a man who collected enemies as easily as he collected friends, and those enemies had long memories. Was this Silas Blackwood connected to that past? Was he a vengeful shadow, finally catching up to her? She remembered the veiled threats from a man named Jedediah, a rancher whose cattle Thomas had allegedly rerouted. Jedediah's eyes had held a cold, predatory glint, a promise of future reckoning. Could Silas be his instrument? "I don't need charity," Elara stated, her voice regaining a brittle edge, though her stomach protested the lie with a fierce pang. Silas's gaze didn't waver. He simply lowered the canteen, then unscrewed its cap, tilting it back and taking a long, deliberate drink, his Adam's apple bobbing with each swallow. The sight of the water, cool and life-giving, was a torment. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Might not be charity, ma'am. Might just be decency. Happens sometimes, even out here." His words were a quiet rebuke, a gentle challenge to her hardened cynicism. He seemed unaffected by her distrust, a stark contrast to the townspeople who had bristled at her very presence. His eyes, the color of distant storm clouds, held a strange patience, a quiet understanding that unnerved her more than any overt threat. He wasn't demanding, or threatening, or judging. He was simply there, an unmoving, silent presence, a stark anomaly in her desolate existence. This quiet persistence chipped away at her resolve, a slow, relentless erosion of her carefully constructed walls. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow and the soft shifting of Silas's horse. Elara's gaze lingered on the canteen, then drifted to the deep lines etched around Silas's eyes, the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow. There was a weariness about him, a hint of struggles unseen, that resonated with her own. He didn't push, didn't press, merely waited, an unwavering presence. This lack of aggression was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. Finally, her parched throat won. "Water," she whispered, the single word a surrender. Silas handed her the canteen, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected shiver through her. The water was cool, sweet, tasting of life itself, and Elara drank deeply, greedily, the thirst and agony only now truly acknowledged. As the immediate craving subsided, a fragile thread of conversation began to weave itself between them. He asked about her journey, her destination, the questions phrased with careful neutrality, devoid of judgment. Elara, hesitantly at first, began to speak, her voice rough from disuse, revealing only fragments of her story. The edges blurred, the painful truths veiled. She spoke of her husband, Thomas, a man who had captivated her with his reckless charm and promises of a grander life, far from the stifling constraints of her upbringing. She spoke of their arrival in the small, dusty town, a place that had initially seemed to offer a fresh start, a reprieve from the shadows of her past. But the reprieve had been short-lived. The town, she explained, was a tightly knit web of suspicion, its inhabitants wary of outsiders, especially those who challenged their entrenched ways. Thomas, with his easy smile and questionable ventures, had quickly become a lightning rod for their scorn. He was a man of ambition, yes, but also of shortcuts, of deals made in darkened corners, of a spirit too wild to be tamed by their rigid piety. Flashbacks flickered through her mind, the whispers in the general store, the averted gazes in the street, the chillingly polite but firm requests for them to move on from the church elders. She remembered Thomas's frustrated outbursts, his attempts to charm them, then his eventual, bitter resignation. The town had never accepted them, seeing them as a blight, a corruption. Their animosity had intensified after a dispute over a land claim, a valuable parcel Thomas had acquired through means the townsfolk considered illicit. It was then, when her pregnancy became undeniable, a visual confirmation of their sin, that the true ostracization began. The town had slowly, deliberately tightened its noose around them, cutting off supplies, refusing services, until their very existence became an unbearable presence. They had been forced to leave, branded as undesirables, outcasts. Silas listened, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. as if he could see the echoes of her past misfortunes shimmering in the heat haze. He offered no pity, no false platitudes, only a quiet, grounded presence that, for the first time in weeks, made Alara feel less alone. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch from her past, a silent confirmation of the weight she carried. Silas, a man of few words but deliberate actions, spent the rest of the day tending to her basic needs. He built a small, efficient fire, the first real warmth Alara had felt in weeks, and boiled water for coffee, its rich aroma a comforting balm in the desolate air. He spoke of the trail, of the changing seasons, of the subtle signs in nature that foretold rain or drought, his words a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil in her mind. He didn't pry, didn't ask about the exact nature of Thomas's dealings or the full extent of the town's disdain. He simply observed, his gaze missing little, yet offering no judgment. As dusk deepened into night, the vastness of the sky above them seemed to shrink, drawing them into a small, intimate circle of firelight. Alara found herself relaxing, just a fraction, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since Thomas's death. She realized, with a startling clarity, that Silas, despite his unsettling presence, was providing a sense of quiet protection she hadn't known she desperately craved. He was not a savior, not a white knight, but a grounded, practical force in a world that had become utterly chaotic. Yet, a shadow of suspicion still lingered. She had seen too much treachery in her short life to fully trust. She remembered Jedediah's furious threats, promises of making Thomas pay if he ever crossed him again. Thomas had shrugged them off, confident in his own cleverness, but Alara had felt a chill that day, a premonition of the storm to come. Was Silas a part of that storm? A quiet agent of retribution? She studied him in the flickering firelight, his profile etched against the darkness. He seemed to possess a stillness, a deep reservoir of calm that bordered on melancholy. He had spoken briefly of his own wanderings, hinting at a past that had left him with little desire for roots, a quiet admission of a shared loneliness. He mentioned a ranch, a place where he used to work, but offered no details, leaving a tantalizing open loop that Alara unconsciously picked at. This shared vulnerability, this quiet acknowledgement of their respective burdens, began to forge an unexpected connection between them. It wasn't born of affection, but of a mutual understanding of hardship, a silent pact of survival in an unforgiving landscape. The crackle of the fire, the distant howl of a coyote, the steady breath of Silas sleeping by the embers, all conspired to lull Alara into a fitful slumber, the first truly restful sleep she had experienced in what felt like an eternity. For a brief few hours, the crushing weight of her abandonment lifted, replaced by the fragile comfort of a stranger's quiet presence, a stark reminder that even in the most desolate corners of the world, unexpected acts of grace could emerge from the deepest shadows. The vast, indifferent expanse of the night stretched around them, but within their small circle of light, a tentative shelter was being built. The morning broke with a deceptive coolness, a temporary reprieve from the sun's harsh dominion. Silas was already stirring, preparing a meager breakfast of hardtack and dried venison. He had clearly made the decision to stay, at least for a while, a fact that both comforted and unsettled Alara. Her growing trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the smallest tremor of deceit. She observed him, the efficient movements of his hands, the way he seemed to read the land around them, his presence an extension of the wild, unyielding landscape. There was an honesty in his practical nature, a stark contrast to the performative piety of the townspeople who had condemned her. But the echoes of her past, the whispers of Thomas's questionable dealings, still clung to her like burrs. The land claim, the one that had truly turned the town against them, had been secured through a legal loophole Thomas had discovered. A loophole that skirted true ownership and left a local family, the McRaes, dispossessed. The McRaes had been beloved figures in the community, and their sudden impoverishment had cemented the town's hatred for Thomas, and by extension, for Alara. She remembered the McRae patriarch, a grizzled old man with eyes that held the quiet dignity of someone who had lost everything, standing outside their house, silently watching them. His gaze had held no malice, only a profound, heartbreaking sorrow that had pierced Alara far deeper than any of the town's outright vitriol. She knew, in her heart, that the McCrace's plight had been the true catalyst for her abandonment, the unforgivable sin in the eyes of the community. This truth, unspoken between her and Silas, hung in the air, a silent judgment that even his kindness could not fully dispel. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, doubling her over. Her breath caught, a strangled gasp. Silas was by her side in an instant, his hands steady, his gaze sharp with concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. Ilara shook her head, tears pricking her eyes, unable to speak, the pain radiating through her body like wildfire. He helped her lie back in the wagon, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You need a doctor," he stated, his voice firm, his decision made. "We can't wait." He began packing their meager camp with a renewed urgency, the quiet, measured pace of yesterday replaced by a focused determination. The nearest town was still days away, a grueling journey across treacherous terrain, a journey Ilara, in her current state, might not survive. This was no longer just about her survival. It was about the life stirring within her, a tiny, helpless creature caught in the crosshairs of her past. The stakes had suddenly escalated, the slow burn tension igniting into a desperate race against time. The journey to the nearest town, called Haven, was a torturous ordeal. Each jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of pain through Ilara, her body a vessel of escalating torment. Silas drove with an unwavering focus, his face grim, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a silent vigil against the unseen threats of the wilderness. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, grounding force. He'd stop when the pain became unbearable, offering sips of water, a steadying hand, his quiet strength a stark contrast to her own weakening resolve. He had to hunt for game to sustain them, disappearing for hours, returning with the silent efficiency of a predator, leaving Ilara alone with her fear and the tightening grip of her body's betrayals. During these periods of solitude, the true weight of her moral ambiguity pressed down on her. She hadn't actively wronged the McCraes, but she hadn't stopped Thomas either. She had been complicit in his schemes, seduced by the allure of a life free from the suffocating confines of her own poverty. She had chosen self-preservation over principle, her own desperate desire for a better life blinding her to the suffering of others. This complicity was the true source of her deep-seated guilt, a wound festering beneath the surface of her outward defiance. It was a secret she carried, a burden that had contributed to her own internal fracturing, making her acceptance of the town's harsh judgment, in some twisted way, feel deserved. Now, as the life within her threatened to slip away, the bitter irony of her situation was a cruel torment. Was this the universe's retribution for her choices? A grim payment for her moral compromises? The thought was a chilling companion on the long, agonizing journey. She sometimes caught Silas watching her, his gaze thoughtful, as if he sensed the invisible weight of her internal struggle. He never commented, never questioned, yet his quiet understanding was palpable. He didn't offer empty reassurances, but his actions spoke volumes. He was here, he was helping, and he would not abandon her. As they neared Haven, the faint outline of structures appearing on the horizon, Ilara felt a surge of both relief and dread. A new town, a new set of eyes, a new round of judgments. Would this place too cast her out? Or would it offer a glimpse of the hope Silas unknowingly embodied? The last few miles were a blur of pain and mounting anxiety. The road ahead was not merely physical. It was a pathway into an uncertain future, fraught with the lingering shadows of her past and the burgeoning unknown of her present. Haven was a small, dusty outpost, indistinguishable from countless others, yet to Ilara, it felt like a beacon of desperate hope. Silas drove the wagon directly to the town's only doctor, a grizzled man with spectacles perched on his nose and a perpetual frown etched into his face. His examination was brief, clinical, and Ilara braced herself for the pronouncement of inevitable doom. But instead, the doctor, a Dr. Eli, merely nodded, his frown softening slightly. "She's in early labor," he announced, his voice gruff but reassuring. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong, and the baby, well, it's fighting too." The words were a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. Ilara clung to them, tears streaming down her face, the raw relief almost as overwhelming as the pain. Silas remained by her side, a silent, unmoving presence, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of quiet support that spoke more than words. As the labor intensified, the pain became a monstrous, engulfing wave, stripping away Alara's defenses, her composure, leaving her raw and exposed. She screamed, she wept, she fought, and through it all, Silas remained. He didn't flinch from her cries, didn't shy away from her agony. He was a steady anchor in a churning sea, his presence a stark contrast to the void left by her past abandonment. In moments of respite, between the waves of pain, fragments of her past would surface, raw and vivid. The coldness of the preacher's wife, the averted eyes of the women in the general store, the venomous whispers about Thomas's sins. It was all laid bare, the injustices she had endured, the complicity she had carried, all rising to the surface. She gripped Silas's hand, her knuckles white, her nails digging into his flesh, a silent plea for him to stay, for him not to abandon her too. He bore her grip without complaint, his gaze never leaving her face, offering a silent promise of his presence. The emotional climax was not a grand, dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, internal reckoning, a raw outpouring of her fear, her pain, her profound sense of being utterly alone in the world. This moment, stripped bare of all pretenses, was the culmination of her journey, the desperate struggle to bring new life into a world that had so readily condemned her. And as a final monumental push brought a piercing cry into the room, a new sound, clean and pure, the climax shifted, transformed from pain to a fragile, overwhelming joy. The doctor handed her a tiny, squalling bundle, a perfect, miraculous miniature of humanity. Alara looked down at her daughter, her small face wrinkled and red, her tiny fists clenching, and in that moment, all the pain, all the fear, all the abandonment faded into insignificance. There was only this perfect, tiny, unblemished life. The sun, finally breaking through the high, dusty window of the doctor's office, cast a golden glow, a subtle yet profound symbol of a new beginning, a quiet baptism in the raw light of a new day. The aftermath of the birth was a quiet landscape of exhaustion and fragile relief. Alara lay in the small, clean bed in the doctor's spare room, her daughter nestled beside her, a tiny warmth against her side. The world outside, the judging eyes and cold shoulders, seemed distant, overshadowed by the profound intimacy of this new life. Silas had left the room after the birth, giving them space, a silent understanding of the sacredness of the moment. He returned later, bringing a small, steaming bowl of broth and a fresh change of clothes for Alara, practical necessities that spoke of a deep, unspoken care. He held the baby for a moment, his large hands gentle, a rare, soft smile touching his lips as he looked down at the tiny face. "She's a fighter," he murmured, his voice husky, a simple statement that resonated with a profound truth. He had witnessed her struggle, had seen her raw vulnerability, and had chosen to stay. The cost of this resolution, however, was not just physical. Alara was irrevocably changed. The woman who had been left to wither on the roadside, defiant yet broken, was now a mother, responsible for a life beyond her own. This new identity brought with it a renewed sense of purpose, but also a deeper vulnerability, a stark awareness of the profound love that now existed within her, a love that could be threatened, that could be lost. The resolution was not a grand triumph, but a quiet, almost melancholic sense of peace. The past, the abandonment, the town's cruelty, these wounds would not simply disappear. They were etched into her memory, a constant reminder of the darkness she had endured. But now they coexisted with a burgeoning light, a fragile hope embodied by the tiny, sleeping form beside her. The future was still uncertain, a vast, untamed wilderness stretching before them. But she was no longer alone. Silas, the quiet cowboy who had appeared from the dust, had become an unexpected anchor, a silent promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. He didn't speak of staying permanently, of settling down, but his actions spoke louder than any words. He helped her with the baby, brought her meals, moved with an easy competence that bespoke a lifetime of self-reliance, yet also a surprising tenderness. Alara found herself watching him, trying to decipher the depths of his own past. Sensing the unspoken stories held within his quiet demeanor, she knew he carried his own burdens, his own shadows, making him, in a strange way, a kindred spirit. Their bond was not one of romantic idealism, but of shared endurance, a hard-won camaraderie, forged in the crucible of desperation. It was a fragile beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. A faint melody of hope rising from the ashes of despair, a testament to the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Days turned into a week in Haven, Ilara slowly regaining her strength, her daughter, whom she named Hope, thriving in her arms. Silas remained, a quiet, steadfast presence, his actions speaking volumes where words were sparse. He found odd jobs around town, mending fences, breaking horses, earning enough to pay for their room and board, his integrity silently vouched for by his work ethic. He never pressed Ilara for details about her past, never interrogated the darker corners of Thomas's life, or the reasons for her total ostracization. This unspoken acceptance, this lack of judgment, chipped away at Ilara's hardened defenses more effectively than any direct inquiry. She, in turn, began to observe him more closely, seeing beyond the stoic cowboy facade. There was a gentle sadness in his eyes, a depth that hinted at losses of his own. One evening, as Hope slept soundly beside them, Silas spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper, as he gazed into the flickering campfire. He spoke of a family, long gone, a homestead swallowed by a wildfire, leaving him with nothing but ash and the vast, echoing silence of the plains. He spoke of a guilt he carried, a futile regret over what might have been, a profound sense of rootlessness that had driven his wanderings. His admission was not a plea for pity, but a quiet unveiling of his own vulnerability, a mirror to her own deep-seated scars. The shared burden of their pasts, of loss and displacement, wove an invisible thread between them, binding them in a way words never could. Ilara realized that Silas, like her, was a survivor, someone who understood the profound cost of life on the edge. He wasn't seeking to replace Thomas, or to fill the void left by the town's rejection. He was simply offering a quiet companionship, a shared path forward in a world that had tried to break them both. The small room they occupied in Haven became a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of peace in the unpredictable frontier. Hope's soft coos, her tiny grasping fingers, were a constant reminder of the profound miracle of life, of the promise that could blossom even in the harshest soil. Silas, with his quiet strength and unspoken understanding, was slowly becoming more than just a rescuer. He was becoming a foundation upon which a new life could be built. Yet, a subtle tension lingered, an open loop in their quiet existence. What would the future hold? Could this fragile peace last? Would the shadows of their pasts ever truly dissipate? Or would they forever haunt the edges of their hard-won tranquility? The question hung unspoken between them, a quiet challenge in the vast, hopeful silence of the night. The decision to stay in Haven, at least for a while, was unspoken, understood between them. Silas continued his work, providing for them with a quiet dignity, while Ilara devoted herself to Hope, her new purpose a powerful shield against the lingering shadows of her past. She learned to navigate the town's cautious glances, the subtle curiosity in the eyes of the townsfolk, with a newfound resilience. She was no longer the defiant, heartbroken widow. She was a mother, and that identity gave her an unyielding strength. Yet, the old town, the one that had cast her out, still held a spectral presence in her mind. She thought of the McCries, their quiet suffering, the injustice of it all. It was a wound that hadn't truly healed, a reminder of her own moral compromises. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she could, perhaps, build a future that honored the lessons learned. She started a small laundry service, taking in clothes from the miners and ranchers, her hands busy, her mind slowly finding a rhythm that drowned out the echoes of despair. Silas would often sit with her in the evenings, quietly sharpening his knife or cleaning his rifle, his presence a comforting hum. They spoke of the changing seasons, of the distant mountains, of the simple, tangible realities of their lives, avoiding the grand pronouncements of commitment or future plans. Their bond deepened through these small, shared moments, a quiet understanding that transcended words. It was a love born not of passionate fire, but of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet dignity of two souls finding solace in each other's presence. The child, Hope, was a constant, vibrant symbol of this new beginning, her laughter a fragile bell chiming in the quiet house. There were still moments of profound sadness, flashes of the desolation she had felt, the bitter taste of abandonment, but they were fleeting now, quickly overtaken by the overwhelming love for her daughter and the quiet strength she drew from Silas. He was not without his own demons, his own quiet battles fought in the depths of his storm-colored eyes, but he faced them with the same grounded resolve he brought to every task. The frontier, unforgiving and vast, had stripped them bare, but in doing so, it had also forged something true and enduring. Their story was not one of grand romance, but of quiet heroism, of two people finding salvation not in escape, but in the steadfast courage to build a life from the ashes, brick by painstaking brick, held together by threads of quiet hope and unspoken promises. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced their small window, each one a tiny, shimmering world, a testament to the infinite possibilities that lay ahead, if only they dared to reach for them. The years that followed were a testament to quiet endurance and the slow, steady forging of a new life. Ilara and Silas never spoke of grand plans, yet their days wove together with an intricate, unspoken precision. Their small laundry business grew, providing a modest but steady income, and the tiny cabin they rented became a home, filled with the scent of lye soap, freshly baked bread, and the sweet, bright energy of their daughter Hope. Hope, with her bright, inquisitive eyes and tenacious spirit, was a constant source of joy and a living bridge to a future Ilara had once thought impossible. She was a wild bloom in a harsh landscape, unafraid to ask questions, to explore, embodying the very resilience that had saved her mother. Silas remained the quiet, steadfast figure, his presence a sturdy oak in Ilara's tumultuous world. He was a father to Hope in every way that mattered, teaching her to track, to ride, to understand the subtle language of the land. His own past, the lost family, the burned homestead, remained a quiet, melancholic undercurrent in his being, a silent sorrow that Ilara understood without needing to articulate. He found a measure of peace in their simple life, in the daily rhythms of work and family, a quiet rootedness he hadn't known since his own youth. Their love, subtle and deep, manifested in the quiet gestures, a shared glance across a crowded room, a hand offered in silent comfort, the unspoken understanding that flowed between them. It was a love forged not in passion's fire, but in the crucible of survival and shared purpose, a testament to the enduring power of quiet companionship and profound respect. Ilara had faced the darkness of abandonment and despair, had grappled with her own moral ambiguities, and had emerged transformed. She understood now that true resilience wasn't about erasing the scars of the past, but about learning to live with them, to let them inform, but not define, her present. The town of Haven had slowly, cautiously, accepted them, not with the effusive warmth of true belonging, but with the quiet tolerance of mutual necessity. Ilara no longer sought their approval. Her worth was measured in the laughter of her daughter and the steadfast devotion of Silas. The journey had been long, fraught with peril and heartbreak, but it had led her to this quiet, hard-won peace. The vast, indifferent expanse of the frontier, once a symbol of her desolation, now represented boundless possibility, a new horizon. The pregnant widow, left to die, had not only survived, but had, against all odds, built a family, a legacy forged in the crucible of hardship, illuminated by the quiet, unwavering flame of hope. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the cabin, painting the scene with a warmth that finally seemed to permeate Ilara's very soul, a tranquil resolution to a story that began in such profound despair, a testament to the simple, profound truth that even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit can find its own unwavering light.